14th, 1984. This is Joe Todd, an interview with, do you prefer Mr. General?
I'm a retired Brigadier General of the United States Air Force.
Hubert Judy.
You can call me Hugh or Hubert, whatever is most convenient.
Sir, where were you born?
I was born here in Woodward, 1915,
What day?
June 20.
1915. Who is your father?
Hubert Stonewall Judy. I'm a junior. I was named after him.
And your mother?
Her name was May, M-A-Y, and her maiden name was Pearson, and last name, of course, married name Judy.
Where were your parents from?
Well, my father was one of the old-timers that came into the no man's land in a covered wagon in 1881 from Fort Worth. And my grandfather started ranching out there. And my mother, home place was in Michigan, but she spent quite a bit of time in Canada. And she came down in this country, and she and my father met and were married in 1913. Married here in Woodward.
Did your father ever say how come his family came to no man's land?
Yes, my grandmother was originally from Virginia, and my grandfather was from Kentucky. And when they were married back there, they were, like most young couples, looking for an opportunity to get started. He had a brother who was down in Texas who had written him and said if he came on down into this country that there would be land opening up and they could homestead on it and get started. He was a horseman, raised in Lexington horse country and loved horses, and he wanted to start a ranch and have a cattle ranch. So they came on down to Fort Worth and then got in a covered wagon and came from Fort Worth up into what now is near Beaver, Oklahoma in 1881. Father was 3 years old at that time.
Could they homestead in no man's land at that time?
No, that was before there was a state, you see. The state was not open until 1907. They were there when there was no law. It was a pretty tough place to bring a family into. They had to build their houses and start from scratch. And they stayed there. They formed, the people that wanted to have law and order banded together, and in due course they got law and order established. But when I first started, it was pretty much the law of the Winchester and the Colt.
Were there many people came here at that time?
No, there were a few early families. I don't know that part of the history as well as I probably should, but our family had neighbors. Most of the neighbors were up and down rivers. They were located on creeks and rivers for water. And their nearest neighbors, as I recall, my grandfather talking, was about 5 miles away. So they were very sparsely settled to start with until it became a state, and then things began to fill up.
Whenever it was open for settlement, for homesteading, were they able to keep their land that they had?
Well, my grandfather had moved from the original place that they were on, and he was up in Kansas for a while near Bernice. And they moved back and settled on the place that one of his sons, Tom Judy, last surviving member of my father's family, still lives. And his son actually runs the ranch now. So to answer your question, when they were able to homestead, but most of it was by lease and purchase arrangements in addition to the homestead. 160 acres won't feed many head of cattle out there. You'd starve to death on 160 acres. And that's upland, sandy country. In the old days, my grandfather was of the opinion they shouldn't have plowed up all of it. Should have left it in grass. And of course, later it was proved correct because a lot of it blew out. The problem still exists. If you get lots of water up there, you can raise good crops. If you don't have the water, it'll blow out on you.
Was your grandfather and father mainly cattlemen?
Yes, my grandfather was entirely cattle. They raised only enough feed crops to feed horses with, sowed feed, all cattle business. And he had Hereford cattle.
I was going to ask what kind did he have.
In fact, that's been the cattle they stayed with. This is rough, broken country up there, and they found through many years of experience that the Hereford cow, and a good range cow, a good big cow, can take better care of her calf and forage better than some of the other breeds. So that's been been a Hereford ranch ever since it was started.
How large is the ranch?
I don't know the exact acreage. My cousin Ronald Judy runs it now, and he has another ranch down on the Cimarron River north of my grandfather's old ranch that joins it. And there are several thousand acres in it. I wouldn't have to put a figure on both ranches.
Yeah. When did your family move from around Beaver down to Woodward?
Well, my father left the ranching business. He was in the cattle business for a number of years, and then he went to business school in Kansas, and they started a bank out of Liberal down at along the railroad there in Texas. I believe the first one was down at Paulette. And he was asked to go down and work in this bank. So he started in working for John George out of Liberal, Kansas in the banking business and learned it. And then when they started the bank at Beaver City, he went in there and ran it as a cashier back in the days when everything was hand posted ledgers, and he was in the banking business for a while. They worked such long hours and they were indoors though that my grandfather came in there, as I understand, and told him he better get out of there and get back out in the fresh air. If you stay here in this inside work, you're not going to get along very well. So he got back out and he ran cattle for a while, and then he moved down to Woodward, and he was the vice president of the Newton State Bank and Trust Company out of Newton, Illinois, and doing farm loans and land management, and that was his primary business. Plus he acquired some land on his own, ran cattle on the side.
What chores did you do around the farm as a small boy?
Well, I lived in town, but I spent all my summers on the ranch. I was interested in horses and riding, and of course I got yoked into a lot of chores like milking cattle, and very few of those on the ranch. They had just enough to get fresh milk and butter. So the milking wasn't a big chore, mostly feeding cattle, riding fences, repairing fences, checking the windmills. I loved horses and liked to ride, so that was a
What kind of
big
horses
fun.
did you have?
Beg your pardon?
What kind of horses did you have?
Well, they were for the most part quarter horse stock mixed with western ponies, Indian ponies.
Does that make a good horse?
Yeah, that's the origin of the quarter horse, as I understand it. It's a cross between the thoroughbred and some of the earlier horses that came out of the old Spanish lines. These were all working ranch horses. Good to ride. You had to know what you were doing, though, because they had to part company with you on occasion.
That's happened to me. When'd you start to school?
I went to school from first grade through high school here in Wood,
And what year did you graduate?
1932.
1932. The Depression, 1930s.
Well, I remember that vividly.
How did that affect you and your family?
It affected my family like it did most people. My mother had an account in one bank. My father had an account in the other. They were checking and savings, and both banks failed without warning. And I can remember coming home from school at lunch one day. My mother was sitting there crying, and I want to know what was wrong. And she said, "We lost what little money we had, and both banks have failed, so we don't have any money." I remember my dad telling her, I said, "Now look, we're going to get along all right. We've got a roof over our head, and we've got a home paid for, and we'll eat." And we had chickens in those days. You had eggs from chickens, and you could get fresh milk from people that had dairy herds, and they butchered beef every year. So I can remember that very vividly. And there wasn't any money from then on. Very, very little money was available. People had to get along with what they had, and then of course the dust storm came in on top of the Depression days, which added to the grief. A lot of people lost their places. A lot of people left the area. My people all stayed here. None of them moved out.
Was that when the Okies went to California?
Yeah, that's what started it, and I guess what started most of that was the fact that a lot of them were on 160-acre homesteads that blew out on them when they plowed them up. thin soil and hit that drought and high winds. It was a pitiful sight. I've seen places out there where you just walk over what used to be a good four-wire fence where the tumbleweeds rolled up against it and the sand just mounted in over it. And they couldn't survive. They couldn't feed their families and they had to go someplace to work, and consequently most of them had borrowed money on their places and they were foreclosed and they lost them.
Would you or could you describe a dust storm?
Yes, I've been in a number of them as a boy. The worst kind that you ran into was associated with a frontal condition where there was a wind moving in just like clouds are in a rainstorm, except there would just be a wall of dust coming towards you with this wind running between 35 to 60 miles an hour and gusting. And this wall of dirt would extend from the ground level up to maybe 10,000 feet in the air, and as it moved in, it'd be just like a series of rain clouds, except it was all dust. And when it hit, it would just cover everything up. In order to breathe, I've been out with my father in the car, and we always carried water in thermos jugs, and you'd wet a handkerchief and hold it up over your mouth and nose, otherwise you'd just get so much dirt in your breathing passages that you practically strangle. And it would get so heavy on the roads when one of these real heavy storms came that you couldn't see the road. You'd have to pull off and stop. Of course, the heaviest part of it, as far as visibility went, wouldn't last too long, sometimes 30, 45 minutes. And then it would gradually pass on and get a little lighter to where you could see the drive. But they're real bad things, and when that dust got in the air, it stayed suspended for a long time.
Is that, I've heard people talk of dust pneumonia.
Well, I was too young to know any of the technical details, but I know there was lots of respiratory trouble from the dust. Lots of people were coughing and carrying on that undoubtedly had inhaled a lot of that dirt and was causing difficulty.
What ended the Depression?
Well, it wasn't any rapid transition. It was a gradual sort of thing. Of course, the government came in and extended aid to the area in terms of helping people that they did all sorts of things. It was a gradual thing. I remember through the 30s, I got out of high school in 32, and it was actually pretty hard to find a job that you could earn very much money at. I was rather fortunate. I went to junior high school here for a couple of years, 33 and 34, and I got a job with Oklahoma Gas and Electric Company, and was trained to be an electric station operator to run the diesel engines. And I managed to get a pretty good wage, but even in 34 and 35, there wasn't a whole lot of money around. As the 30s went on, things began to pick back up, and after the aftermath of the Dust Bowl, then your agriculture began to pick back up. For several years, people didn't have grain to sell. They didn't have wheat crop. A lot of the cattle had gone out. So it was a slow transition from 30, well, I'd say from 32 up to about 37 or 8. It was slow, work was picking up, the country was coming back, beginning to heal from this Dust Bowl. Cattle business was picking up. But it was a pretty tough time, and the people that stayed through it, that weathered all this, deserve all the goodness they've gotten today, because they stayed through thick and thin, in my judgment.
Did you do any work for WPA or CCC?
No, I didn't. There was a big camp north of town out here, but I was fortunate. I went to work for OG&E and learned electrical diesel engineering trade. And I went into construction work, and after I'd been out of school for about 4 years, my dad and I had a talk, and he said, it might be a good idea if you think about going back to school unless you want to nurse diesel engines the rest of your life. I thought about it, so I went down to OU in 38 and finished. I graduated there in 1940. But even then, in 1940, things were still tight. There wasn't a lot of money around. I worked my way through college, and my folks didn't have money to send me to school in those days.
What was your major at OU?
I went through the business school, majored in business, but I had several engineering subjects. I was always interested in engineering, but my major was in business.
Did you live on campus or off campus?
I lived off campus. I worked out at the hospital, helping run their electrical power plant.
At Central States?
Yeah, for in exchange for board and room and a little money to get through school. That's how I got through 2 years of school.
Who gave the commencement speech, 1940?
I don't recall. I left school because I was, on graduation day, I was supposed to report at Fort Sill for a physical examination for the Aviation Cadet Training Program. I spent 2 years in the National Guard while I was going to college. And they put out a notice, anybody interested in flying could go down and take the physical, and I had a college degree at that point, so I didn't have any problems with the entrance requirements. And I left the day that the graduation exercises were given. I went in early and made arrangements to explain my situation, and they gave me my certificate, but I didn't actually attend the graduating ceremony.
What was your duties in the National Guard?
I was in C Company, combat engineers. Started out as a private, went through grades up to staff sergeant. I was taught all the basic infantry tactics, and rifle, and automatic weapons, and of course we were trained in building and putting up bridges and doing electrical work, which I had some background in.
Who was the AG at that time?
Which?
The AG of the National Guard?
Well, I can't tell you the AG. My company commander's name was Cloyd, Richard Cloyd. He was a captain. He was a close friend with General Doherty, who was commander later of the 45th Division. They were about the same vintage.
Did you know General Doherty?
I know him very well personally. He's into Masonic work, and I am too, and I see him quite frequently.
I'm a family man.
I am too.
Tell me about Fort Sill, going down for the physical.
Well, they had the medical center at the hospital at Fort Sill, where all of the people coming into the military system had to go to get their physical exams. And you reported in there, and they had a record-keeping department where they took your data. You had orders to report to, and they scheduled you for the physical. And the entrance physicals to the flying school was very tough in those days. If they found anything at all, they wouldn't admit you. And I hadn't had a right knee tore up playing football, and they kept me over an extra day having me do knee bends to demonstrate that knee would work all right. That was one of the things I remembered about it.
Was it working okay?
It worked all right. I got in, but it made lots of noise. It ground and grated where the cartilage had broken out. I passed it okay, but I did get held over an extra day.
After you passed the physical, then did you go in the military at that point?
Yes, I've been in the course in the Oklahoma National Guard, and when you go into the cadet program in those days, this was 1940, you went in as an aviation flying cadet, and you had a 9 months intensive training. You had 3 months of basic, 3 months, they called it primary, and then you had 3 months of basic. And the primary was given over at Tulsa at Spartan Flying School. And if you passed the primary, then they sent you down to Randolph. You had 3 months of basic. And from Randolph, you went to Kelly. Kelly was advanced flying school in 3 months. So if you got through all 3 stages, you graduated and was given a second lieutenant's commission. And I was able to get through it.
How long did that take to get your commission?
Well, from the time we started, it was the biggest part of the year. Very intensive training. we learned all of the basic military things at Randolph, particularly in Kelly. Primary school was a lot of academics. There are a lot of academics in this too. If you busted your academics, you got washed out. At the time I went through the cadet program, the washout rate was about 60%. Only 40% got through the thing because you could wash out either on academics or lack of flying ability.
Were the academics, I guess, similar to your college education?
Well, they were concentrated. They were oriented to the military need. Quite a bit of mathematics involved, aerodynamics, engines, fundamentals, communications, all this sort of thing, plus military government, military law, the things that an officer needs in order to perform the officer's responsibility. I'd been flying quite a bit before I got into the flying cadet program. I learned to fly here at Woodward, soloed in 1928. So I'd formed some bad habits by the time I got into the flying program. I had to change.
Who taught you how to fly here in Woodward?
Art Studi. He was one of Wiley Post flying instructors that lived here in Woodward.
What was his name?
Studi, S-T-U-D-E, Art Studi. Art was later killed down at Amarillo in an air show. He used to barnstorm and do acrobatic shows for fairs and state fairs and different events. I flew an old World War I trainer called a Lincoln Standard with an OX-5 engine in it. A friend of mine, Lance and Rodman, and I were crazy about airplanes. You see, when I was a youngster, we were at the impressionable age at the time Lindbergh flew the North Atlantic. And boy, that got every kid's attention out here that could fly a kite. We had lots of wind to fly kites with, so Lance and I built a glider, and we flew it a little bit, learned the controls. And we worked for Studi after school on the weekends, helped sell tickets and wash airplanes down. And that's how I got started in my interest in airplanes, and I still have it. I still fly. Not too much, but
You say you had some bad habit that you had to unlearn?
well, yeah, I'd learned from Studi, and he was an expert acrobatic man who flew the airplane right at max performance most of the time. And I'd learned to operate the way he did, and when I got in the military, we were flying heavier airplanes that stalled out a lot quicker and at higher speeds. And I tended to fly almost too slow in certain maneuvers, and I had to quit that. But I understood what they were telling me, so I was able to learn.
When did you get your commission? The date?
March 1941.
What were your thoughts on the war in Europe at that time?
Well, I was in the war in Europe.
You were?
Went over to the second in command of the B-24 combat outfit of the 8th Air Force.
But that was after we got in the war, wasn't it?
Yes.
And when you got your commission, we weren't in the war yet.
No, it's true. Well, the consensus was that most of us that were watching it, and we all were, was that it's just a matter of time the United States was in the war. We were in training pilots. When I graduated, they kept me as an instructor at Kelly Field. And our training program accelerated, so we were flying. I was teaching in single engine pursuit, and I was flying about 160 hours a month instructing. And this meant you were out there at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you were airborne at first light, and you flew a class. You were assigned classes. I had between 6 and 8 students all the time. And you took these students through all the stages of their training, and as soon as they had finished, some of them might not get through. And the ones that washed out were gone, but the ones that graduated then went on out into the old Army Air Corps in those days. And we didn't have time to look up, but we could all feel this war was coming, just a matter of time. As a matter of fact, I was, when the Japs hit Pearl Harbor, I had the first 3-day pass I'd had since I'd been commissioned, and I was up the ranch in Beaver County visiting with a family. They had a family get-together. When we heard on the radio that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor, they put out a call to all military people to report back to base. So I got in my car and drove back to San Antonio and reported to Kelly. And of course, we were in the war at that point as far as the Japs were concerned. But you could see the war in Europe going, and I think at least we were surprised and enraged when the Japs hit us from Pearl Harbor. But we knew it was just a matter of time we'd have to face up to Hitler. He was rolling.
After Pearl Harbor Day, what'd you do?
Well, they kept me there as a flying instructor until spring of 1942. It was May of 42. I got orders to report to Washington, D.C., the headquarters Army Air Corps operations staff. This was before the Pentagon was built. And we were down in the old War Department building on Constitution Avenue. And I reported in there with 7 other young officers from the Air Training Command to work on the staff and develop plans for the expansion of the Air Corps. General Arnold was our chief at that time, and my immediate superior was then Colonel Hoyt Vandenberg, who later became chief of the Air Force. I stayed in the staff there in Washington through the spring of 42. Spring of 43, I was up there about a year. We were forming units, aircraft were coming off the assembly lines, the crews were being trained, and they were getting ready to go overseas, and I wanted to get into the war. I didn't want to spend it behind a desk, so I kept bugging my bosses about how about letting me get out and go through some of the training schools. So they let me go through the B-20 or B-17 4-engine school. I completed that, and then I was back in the staff, and then I needed commanders for what they call provisional groups. And they were beginning to get B-24s off the assembly line, and they were forming B-24 units. So they told me, they said, we're going to take you out of the B-17 lineup and put you in B-24s. It was all right with me. I just wanted to get with it. So I went through the B-24 school, and then I trained the 331st Provisional Group and took it to England in the summer of 43. And then I came back, and there was a deputy command job open with the 448th B-24 bomb group. It was just being formed up in Wendover, Utah. And they asked me if I wanted to be deputy commander, and I said, sure. If the commander wants me, well, I'm ready. So I went out there and interviewed Colonel Thompson. He interviewed me, rather. And we hit it off, and he decided, okay, you're my air executive.
What grade were you at that point?
I was a major at that
Major.
time, yeah. And I joined the 448th and trained them. That was my job, to train the outfit and get it ready for combat. And we took 75 B-24s down through South America, across Africa, and up into England. We arrived over there in October 1943. Went into combat just very shortly after that. I stayed with the group until the spring of 1945 in combat against the Germans.
Tell me about some of your missions.
Well, when we first started operating, we were based at a place called Seething near Norwich, England, which is about 11 miles inside the coastline of the English Channel. And the Germans had occupied France, of course, and when we took off to go on a mission against Germany in the early days, we didn't have any fighter escort. So we'd have to climb to altitude and get in combat formation right over our airfields. Because when we started across the channel, it'd be somewhere between 400 and 500 fighters, German fighters waiting for us. And when we headed in, of course, they were all over us. And we flew tight formations for mutual fire support off our 50 caliber machine guns. And we had to fight our way into the target, and each target was defended heavily by anti-aircraft. And when we'd go in on the bomb run, then the German fighters would pull up away from us because the ack-ack was so intense, the flak. We'd have to go through that, getting our bombs on the target. And when we came out the other side, the fighters were waiting for us to jump back on us. So in the early days, it was a real tough deal. And of course, the British Bomber Command had talked it over with our commanders, and they were very skeptical that we could survive daylight bombing. They had tried it, and German fighters and the anti-aircraft was too tough. Their losses were too high. So our commanders felt that if we developed enough proper firepower and tactics, that we had a good chance of being able to do a lot of damage on the targets. In those days we were going after petroleum plants, war-making type targets. We were after marshalling yards where the railroads came together and they shipped a lot of their war supplies through them. We bombed submarine pens, German Navy. We hit military installations. We bombed airfields, airplane factories, war-making type targets. And as time went on, we did take heavy losses initially. But then we began to get better fighter coverage. When we first started operating, the only fighter coverage we had was a British Spitfire, and they could only go just about across the channel, and they had to come back. But then we got the P-38s came in, and we got the P-47s, and they hung exterior tanks on those, and the fighter boys could go with the bombers in and help fight the German fighters off. And as they developed the fighter escort capability, they got a bunch of the fighters off their back, but they were still chewing us up pretty good. And then as the P-51 came in, well, that was the best of the fighters in many respects. It could fight the German air-to-air battle better, although the P-47 did a fine job. But as the war began to progress through the middle 40s, well, we had fighter escorts with us, but in the first 7 or 8 months of the war, we were pretty much on our own in the bomber part. And it was tough. Never say the German's not a strong adversary. He was tough.
What kind of bombs did you carry?
For the most part, we carried a 500-pound general-purpose bomb. We sometimes carried incendiaries, depending on the type of target. We went after a petroleum target. We'd carry a mixture, oftentimes, of incendiaries and demolition bombs. Demolitions to break the tanks up, and incendiary bombs to get the fire straight.
What was your position on these missions?
I commanded a group lead at the minimum. I commanded wing leads and division leads.
So are you in the lead airplane?
I commanded the whole formation. Yeah, every mission I flew.
And what does a commander do in the mission?
Well, you're responsible for the success of the mission. You have to be sure that the formation works properly. A group is part of a wing. There are usually 3 or 4 groups to each wing, and you each have your own position in the formation. You have to be sure that your unit that you're commanding is in the proper position. You have to be sure when you get into the target area that you have to uncover these formations and take your proper bombing sequence and not overrun the other guys. And you have to adjust to any difficulties. Weather was one of the big problems, very difficult problem. Clouds lots of times at 25,000 feet.
How many missions did you fly?
I flew 31 missions.
Ever get shot down?
No. I had airplanes shot all to pieces. I just barely got back, but I was one of the lucky ones. I was the only original man in our original outfit that was still operating a year and a half after we started combat. All the other guys were shot down, including the commander.
How bad were your losses?
I don't know that I can quote exact figures. A lot of our losses were resulting from enemy action, but believe it or not, cold was one of our early adversaries. We were flying at 25,000 feet out over the North Sea, and the free air temperature gauges on these airplanes would record minus 60 degrees, and it would go clear down to minus 60 and stay there. And you were in this extreme cold for 4, 5, and 6 hours. So we got a lot of severe frostbites. When we started flying, we didn't have proper equipment, proper protection from the cold. And no one anticipated this. We'd never operated aircraft at that altitude in those extreme cold areas before. We had to learn a lot of things. The grease on our machine guns was wrong. It wouldn't work. We had to take all the grease off. Guns would jam up and they wouldn't fire. But there's so many angles to this, you could talk for 2 days on it and still just barely scratch the surface. The one thing that I'm real proud of our 8th Air Force, that in spite of all the enemy opposition, we never turned back from a single mission because of enemy action. The only time they turned back was because of weather, where they got recalled from higher command authority. As I mentioned earlier, we were bombing daylight, and we made the daylight bombing work, and then the RAF Bomber Command bombed at night. So when we got this thing going in full stride, the Germans were catching it around the clock. They were getting it 24 hours a day. We managed to grind them down, of course, to win the war, along with our other action.
What happens when an airplane gets shot down?
Well, in our case, we carried a 10-man crew, and if a man's not incapacitated when the airplane commander, unless you get a direct hit and it blows up, he recognizes the airplane's not flyable. Maybe you've got a fire on board, or you've got engines damaged to where it can't fly anymore, and he'll give the order for the crew to bail out. Every man had a parachute. They bailed out, and of course, before the invasion, well, it was all occupied territory, and every man had bailed out and was taken, most of them were taken prisoners and put in prison camps, and they had a rough time of it. A bunch of my boys wound up in prison camps. I went over, by the way, on this D-Day celebration this past June and met with guys in my outfit I hadn't seen for 41 years. One of the boys was shot down over Berlin flying my right wing, Lieutenant John Grunow. I hadn't seen John since his airplane was hit, and I see the airplane going down off my right wing, and he told me what happened to his crew. They bailed out. They managed to get out about 50 miles out of Berlin. The airplane was losing engines and power, and he finally had to give the order to bail out. This is what happened when you still had control. The commander would give the order, and then the crew would all bail out, and the pilot and co-pilot would be the last two to leave the airplane. But he said the airplane got to where it wasn't flyable, so he told them to bail out. He landed a rather humorous occasion, and yet it was a tough situation. He landed in a fairly open area. It was a potato field with woods behind it and woods on the other side, and there were a bunch of German women out there digging potatoes. And when he came down, he saw this German squad car coming toward him. They had seen him, and they were going to capture him, so he had brief instructions from our intelligence people. We all carried an escape kit with us. And he was told to be polite to people, and the only German words he knew was Guten Morgen. And John said that when he hit the ground, he picked his parachute up, and he was right on the edge of some trees, and stuffed it back under the roots of the tree and kicked some leaves over it. And he could hear this squad car coming with his German patrolmen. He started running across this open field to get to the other woods over there, and these German women saw him coming. And of course, they'd heard all these stories about invasion and American being such beasts, and I suppose they thought they were going to get shot or something. But John said all he could remember was to be polite, so he stopped as he came to these German women and says, Guten Morgen. And then broke into a run and ran on over into the woods. Well, it wasn't within about an hour they'd captured him. The German patrol came across, and the women pointed where he'd gone. He'd tried to bury himself down under a tree, but they found him. And he was a prisoner for a year and a half, and he told me a lot about what went on there. He was lucky to survive. He's in good health, has a fine family, 5 sons.
You know Mr. Beckwith?
Pardon?
You know Mr. Beckwith in Beaver?
No, I don't.
He was in, we just did an interview with him, and he was on the B-24th and got shot down. So we did a complete interview with him yesterday. And he went through the prison camps.
Well, the boys who were in there can tell you about it. And
And
there were a lot of very unpleasant things, a lot of bad things going on.
in fact, he was on the invasion of Normandy. He bombed the coast.
Well, I led one of the missions on
Well, he was,
that Normandy
And-
invasion.
what he said, his entire crew was captured, and they're all still living today here in the States.
That's remarkable.
And they said they want to have a reunion, but they just haven't. And one lives in Oklahoma City, and they keep talking about getting together. And he talked about, being shot down, the plane hit and blowing one of the engines off.
Yeah.
I don't have his uniform.
It'd be interesting to know which unit he's in because they were all within a radius of about 25 miles. My outfit was a 448. There's a Britisher who's written a book about called The 1,000-Day Battle. That is a real good story of the beginning of the war in Europe and then the winding down. And it particularly, this fellow lives right next to the area where our unit was based, and he has a lot of the history of the 448 pennant. I had a good visit with him when I was back in England in June.
He was on 31 missions. And he said that was their last mission. They were going back to the States the next day and got shot down. Very last mission. And he spent,
It happened to a lot of men.
and he was shot down.
What target were they on, they say?
Well, he was taken to Frankfurt. And he was a prisoner almost a year. We talked about the prison camp that he lives over in. Does he live in Beaver?
No, he lives in Belcourt.
Balco.
Did you get his commander's name?
No. But he was based out of Shipton, England.
Chip. I believe that was a 445. I've got records of it up at the house. I can
You gotta get in contact with him over Balco. And
Kenneth Beckwith. Belcourt.
We had a Colonel Beckwith from the service. I know, but obviously it's different people.
And he said the bad thing was that the time that he was really fearing for his life was when the German people came by and realized they were airmen. Because the German people hated the airmen because of the bombing.
Sure.
And he said that they were throwing rocks at him, spitting on him, and he thought they were going to be torn limb from limb. And he said, but thinking about it, he couldn't really blame them. Having airplanes come over and bombing their homes and killing their families.
How did he escape? Did he tell you?
He was liberated.
He was what?
Liberated.
Oh,
Liberated April 23rd, 1945.
The
And-
3rd Army liberated Grunwald. He was in prison camp down there in Munich. At the time 3rd Army came in, he was liberated.
Yeah. Well, he was taken to Berlin, and they were in the prison outside of Berlin.
Was he in Stugloff 3, do you recall? That's the same one that Grunwald and
He
some
was
of our other boys were.
taken up by the Baltic Sea,
Stugloff 3.
and he said they were all airmen, all U.S. airmen in this prison camp. He said they have 11,000 of them. And the Russians started pushing, and they marched all 11,000
He
airmen
was
out.
in the same outfit Grunwald was in then.
Okay.
Because they marched them from there down, put them in trains part of the way, and then they had to march the rest of the way.
He said they were
Winter
marching.
time,
He said they're marching back and forth because the Americans would push and they'd head east. The Russians would push, they'd head west and march back and forth. They were on the road 80 days, and they marched 800 miles in 80 days, back and forth across Germany. And then he said the German guards realized the war was ending, and he said that,
they camped down by Munich when the 3rd Army.
okay, now he said this is number 4, Thalog something 4.
Yeah, that's better than Stugloff 3.
Okay, and he said this was all U.S. airmen, and they had a camp for Canadian airmen and British airmen. They were all segregated.
It was a different camp.
Yeah. And
My operations officer was in there with Grunwald,
mhm.
Major Ron Kramer.
What'd you do in BED?
Well, interesting, I came off combat, and my former boss, who'd been Director of Operations in the Pentagon, was in Eisenhower's staff at that time. And he called me down to London, wanted to know if I wanted to be his chief of staff. He was going into Germany, going up to Berlin with General Clay. And I was pretty unhappy with the Germans at that point. We'd lost a lot of good people. And I decided I'd like to go on up to Berlin and see what this was all about and what they were going to do with it. So I joined Eisenhower's staff and was in on the capture and the planning of the capture of the remnants of the Luftwaffe. We got them. We had intelligence teams out that got all the records. We helped work with the people that got the scientists out of Peenemünde, the rocket group, Werner von Braun and those people. And I moved with the headquarters on the continent. We went into Paris, and I was there at Fontainebleau in the outskirts on VE Day. We pushed the Germans back at that point out of Paris, and Paris went wild. They stayed up all night and marched the historic Victory March. Everybody, civilians and all the men in the uniforms, arm in arm. There was no sleep in Paris, VE night. We were down there with them. And we moved our headquarters on up into Frankfurt, and we went from Frankfurt on into Berlin. And I flew the first airplane into Tempelhof, an American airplane that went in there after the shooting had stopped, which was a stripped down B-17. It sucked down the shell hole. I couldn't even taxi it in. Berlin was wild. There were Russians all over the place. Lots of gunfire, everybody armed.
I was going to ask, tell me about the Russians in Berlin and...
Well, I went into Berlin in July 1945, and the Russians had overrun all of Berlin. Under the Potsdam Agreement, there were 3 zones established in Berlin for occupation. The U.S. zone, the British zone, and the Russian zone. And in the early days, General Clay set up the headquarters there. He had Ambassador Robert Murphy, our senior political advisor. My boss was Major General Harper. I was his deputy chief of staff. And our first job was to try to get the zones established and get the Russians out. The Russian soldiers, when they came in, they were the victors of war, and they were out to get anything they could get their hands on, and there was lots of drinking going on, celebration, and there were a lot of gunfire, a lot of shooting, a lot of people killed every night.
Oh, were Germans killed, Russians, or what?
Well, there were armed people, the SS troops were still in the area, German soldiers that were trying to get out, and some of them were armed, had weapons. They had little resistance pockets around until all those were cleaned up. You had gunfire all the time. And then gradually the Russians got established. And the Russian army, of course, they're very strict with their soldiers. But they weren't about to slow them down because they felt they'd earned a little victory celebration initially. But they got them back in their zone, and the U.S. had our zone, the British had theirs. But it took about 60 to 90 days to get this thing kind of cleaned up where it was the way it was supposed to work. And those were hectic days.
Mm-hmm.
The next thing they did, the French initially wasn't in the Potsdam Agreement, but they carved a section of Berlin out of the British zone and the U.S. zone and made a zone where the French participated. So you wound up with a quadripartite control mechanism. The Russians and British, French and American. And that's the way the thing started, the occupation phase.
Mm-hmm. And the Russians never given up their sections.
Well, they pulled back into the Russian zone.
But they still occupy East Berlin and East Germany.
Well, that was part of the original agreement, the political agreement that the leaders entered into was to let them occupy that area. That's where a lot of the problems come from today with respect to Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Bulgaria. You go back and read those historic political documents and you will see exactly what happened. And, that was done, everything was looking toward controlling Germany, to keep Germany from getting strong and starting World War III. They had started two of them. You had World War I and World War II. Were initiated with the German idea of world conquest. And Hitler came a lot closer to making that than a lot of people realized. One of the tragic things was that they were working on the nuclear weapon before we were. And not too many people know that.
That the heavy water project?
We bombed a heavy water project out of Norway that the Germans had going, and if they'd have gotten that, been permitted to proceed with it, they might have had the nuclear weapon before anybody else had. And it would have been a different world. They'd have put one on England, and England had to give up. At that time, they were developing long-range airplanes based in Oslo, Norway, that had the capability of flying non-stop to New York and back. It wouldn't take them one of those airplanes with a nuke on it to hit New York. And our leaders have been hard-pressed on what to do.
And
Well,
what stopped them with this nuclear bomb? I didn't understand what stopped Russia.
It wasn't Russia, it was Germany.
Or Germany, I mean.
We bombed the plant out that they were making what they call heavy water, which is part of the uranium developing process that's required for nuclear weapons. We bombed their plant out, and they were way ahead of everybody else.
Is that right?
That was way before the Manhattan Project ever started in this country. You don't read about this much in the history books. In fact, I don't think it's taken into account very much. But if Hitler had gotten that weapon before the Allies had it,
In a different world.
well, they would control the world.
How close did Hitler come to winning that war?
Oh, I don't think anyone can say with any degree of certainty. Hitler, fortunately, made some mistakes. Hitler did not invade England, which he could have done when he had the power to do it. And instead, he opened a second war front with Russia. So he wound up fighting a two-front war when he could have piecemealed it. Your people that have studied this thing will tell you that if he'd gone in and taken over England, we'd lost a great ally and also a base to operate from.
Also, that would have been the war too, wasn't it?
Pardon?
That would have been the end of the war, wasn't it? Because Germany was at war with England, declared war on him, and they're the only country fighting him then, because he had France occupied. Had he captured
He'd already
England?
taken all the continent.
Yeah.
But you see, he didn't have to try to take over England. His general staff, I understand, recommended he do that, but instead, Hitler had some great vision of being able to handle that one whenever he chose, and at the same time open the war with Russia. So he went into Russia, and of course the winter, the cold got him just like it did Napoleon eventually. And the Russians lost millions of people in that war. That's one of the things that people need to understand today about why Russia is so deadly fearful of Germany becoming unified again and starting back through the same cycle. German people are our allies now, and good allies, and as long as they don't have leaders that lead them astray, things will stay on an even keel. But we've had two main world wars resulting from the German dream of global empire. Of course, the Russian leaders, according to all indications, there are some of those that have that. They want a global empire with the seat of communism in Moscow, and that's our present day problem. Try to contain this and get it under control.
What rank were you in at the end of the war?
I was a colonel,
Colonel? Full colonel?
full colonel. I was a colonel 17 years before I made brigadier.
Were you in the Berlin Airlift?
I was there before the Berlin Airlift. No, I came back to the States in October of '46. They ordered me in the then Army Air Corps headquarters, and I was executive for plans and operations and worked in the State Department. Helped get negotiations going for all our base structures in Europe. I was there when Korea broke out in the operations and plans staff.
Were you there when they developed the Air Force?
Yes, when the Air Force became separate.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I was there, and I was the first Air Force liaison officer for the State Department. That's when we worked on the bases in Europe. And I was in plans and operations most of the time, except for command jobs.
Do you think Hitler thought the United States wouldn't enter the war? Was the reason she didn't invade?
Well, he was getting mixed signals from a lot of our political leaders, because we had a lot of people who, according to the records that I read, were strongly against the United States becoming involved in the war in Europe. It depends on how they interpret these things. I suppose that he got a lot of advice that the United States was sufficiently isolationist in our policies that he didn't have much worry about us getting into it. It would have been interesting to see what would have finally happened. Of course, history never retraces itself, but the Japs hitting Pearl Harbor was the thing that triggered this country into turning and saying, well, gosh, we've got to get with this thing, because then we had adversaries in Japan. Here was Europe being overrun with Hitler, and Japan and Hitler had a pact. They were together. They were going to split up this world, at least initially, to where Japan had Asia and Malaysia. And they had a lot to gain down there. The Malaysian area is very wealthy in natural resources, and the rice basket of the Asian continent. They'd gotten control of that. Japan would have had a power base there, and Hitler would have had all of Europe. And of course, he was shooting for control of this country.
Mr. Beckwith said that there was a German guard at the prison camp he was in, and they called him Chicago, because he was from Chicago, but he was German ancestry. And he went back to Europe and got caught up in the German army, and he was very pro-German. But he was born in this country.
Well, we had a lot of people in this country, of course, that were pro-German that were still here, too. They picked up a lot of them and took them out of different jobs all over the country.
In southwest Oklahoma, around Corn, Colony, Weatherford, in that area,
And over here, Shattuck.
there's a large German population. In fact, they said in Lawton there are 2 houses, brick houses, and they have a Nazi swastika built in the fireplace out of brick. The houses were built in the late 30s by German families, and the Nazi swastikas are built, not the Indian swastika.
All those people that believed in that were very ardent in it. They believed it all the way. It's one of the problems our country has, because we're composed of so many different ethnic groups, particularly primarily from Europe. Anytime you get contrary to, say, in this case with Germany, you've got a lot of Germans that are sympathetic to their cause, and then there's a question as to where their loyalties lie. Whether they're more loyal to Germany than they are to the United States. That's one of the things that gets real sticky.
Interviewed with Mr. Rudolf Fleisch. He was born in, he was Volga-Deutsch. Family came from Russia. They were German. They lived in Russia. He came here at the age of 7 in 1914, I think, 1913. Started school here in 1916. Didn't speak English. Then the war broke out. And the other kids taunted him, made fun of him. The teacher whipped him because she thought he was cussing her. But he couldn't speak English, and she would try to teach him English. And then I was thinking, that may, when you're treated like that by the Americans, and but kids can be cruel.
Yes.
You bet they can. And I'm sure there are cases like that.
Well, anything else you want to talk about?
No, I'll just tell you that I've been interested in aviation all through the years, and I still fly. And I have a little airplane I keep my hand in.
I used to fly. I flew helicopters.
Did you?
I spent 18 months in Vietnam. I was just a crew chief. I wasn't a pilot.
You know what it's all about.
No.
Anybody's a crew chief knows that airplane backwards and forward.
Did you agree with President Truman over the way he handled the war after he came in power? After Roosevelt died?
In what way? What do you mean?
Well, with MacArthur.
Well, there are a lot of mixed views on this. I think as considering personality MacArthur had, and there's some indications that he had some aspirations for political leadership. As a political leader, I don't expect Truman had much choice. If he'd left MacArthur in, MacArthur might have been one of the following presidents. A very popular
Or
man.
you think he would have?
It's a possibility. I say it's a possibility.
What about the fall?
I think Truman relieved him, not only for reasons of apparently MacArthur was not carrying out his orders. MacArthur wanted to do some more things over there that Truman didn't want to get involved in. I think that was the number one item. I've read that there are from people who may or may not know that by him coming out of there, he was taken out of any possible political arena too. But I think the primary reason was that he was relieved for not following national policy. I happen to be an admirer of Truman. I think a lot of people criticize him for putting the nuclear weapons on Japan. But what the people that criticize him for that haven't stopped to look at the other side of the coin, that the Japanese were dug in on that island. They were dedicated to fight to the last man. And our knowledgeable Army people have indicated in the best estimates that we would have lost between 800,000 and over 1 million men going in and trying to occupy Japan.
Yes.
And it's a tragic thing that the Japanese were given every opportunity to surrender prior to putting nuclear weapons on them. And even after the first one was put down, they wouldn't surrender.
No, they didn't.
They were given an opportunity to surrender at that point. And when they didn't, they got the second one, and all of a sudden they said, well, this won't do the job for us, let's quit. But Japan was dedicated to defending that island, and I really believe this. I think it would have cost the United States between 800,000 and 1 million
Oh, yes. I believe so.
fine young men going in to try to liberate that island. And when you equate the cost of what we did to stop that war, we didn't start it. If we'd have gone in there, and as some people thought we should have gone into conventional weapons and finished that at the cost of another 1 million young lives out of this country, I think Truman did the correct thing.
My father was in Europe during the war, when the war ended, and he'd been through combat, all the way through Italy, France, and Germany. Pulled out, put on a boat, and they're going to the Panama Canal to Japan when the war ended. They said they went and they threw everything overboard, pushed the jeeps overboard, trucks, equipment, weapons, everything.
Kicked it out. Well, boys got out of the trucks over in Europe so fast that the doors were left swinging in the breeze. They wanted to get out and come home.
Yes.
They just walked off and left his war equipment. But that's the American way. We want peace. If we have to fight, we'll fight and get the job done. But we don't like war.
If we got into a war today with Russia, it wouldn't last very long after that. But don't you think that Russia's got people right here in the United States to take over immediately?
Well, I learned this in World War II. The old European nations established people in other countries. And the first example of this I saw was right there in the town of Norwich, England, near where we were based. there was a watchmaker, a clockmaker, that had been living in Norwich for 26 years. He was supposedly a Swiss, but in fact was a German, who had been living in this community 26 years, and they caught him with a wireless in the attic of his house, sending intelligence reports to Germany about wee hours in the morning, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, in code, advising all of the bombing units that were in the area. And they listened to him for a while. They had him honed in on a seeker, finder. And that guy had been in position 26 years before that war started. Now, when you take a country that finds that far ahead to put agents into a country, and when you take a country that's wide open as the United States is, we don't really have many secrets left here. Agents just come in and take stuff away from us. You can rest assured that there are people here in this country who have strong affiliations for the Russians, just like there were Germans. And whether they're in sufficient position to gain immediate control, they've been in position to help a takeover process. So I spent a lifetime studying this. I was Chief of Long Range Plans of the Air Force for 2 years. I've had access to all the top intelligence information. And my last tour of duty, I had 2 tours of NATO, and I was Chief of Plans and Operations of the NATO Military Committee. I spent half my time in Paris and half the time in London, working with the Europeans on planning for the NATO defenses. I've had a chance to watch this thing all through the war as a young officer, a combat officer, and then I've been in plans and operations up through my more senior years. And it's been an eye-opener to me, because we're basically, with all due respect, we're pretty naive about this intelligence business, the way these other countries operate. We've had enough experience now after 2 wars, 2 big wars, where we have a lot of knowledgeable people in the business too. But we're the only country that has power that is not seeking to gain power by occupying other territories. We've never been that kind of a country, and we aren't yet. And I hope we never become that. But these other countries have all got feelers out. They've got agents in here. And I find that some people are naturalized citizens. I discovered this in Washington, that have deep affiliations for other countries.
Yes.
Come from them, they have relatives back there, intermarriages. All of these things add up, but I think if we ever get into Russia, God forbid, if we ever get in a nuclear scandal, there'll be a whole lot left to take over, unfortunately.
Well, when Khrushchev made this trip across the country, my husband said he's making his plans, putting his spies in position. And then he made his primes, and he would bury us. And we had a friend in California. He was a conductor on the train that went ahead of Khrushchev's train. See, they had a train to go ahead so that if there was any bombs, while this train didn't blow up.
Yeah.
And he was visiting us shortly after that. And he said the same thing. He said, Khrushchev is here, making his plans now. But of course, this man thought it would be in the next decade or so. But so far it hasn't come to pass. But I don't know, I just can't trust him in any way.
Well, they've proven that they're interested in exporting their communist doctrine worldwide to hopefully get a communist organization established that they can rule from Moscow.
Yes.
This is their clear pattern, and how far they push it. The Russian is a conservative person. He's a great chess player. They're the world's greatest chess players, and I worked with the Russians quite a bit in Berlin. I sat at the conference table a lot. One of the things I found out that every military man in Russia that is a graduate of their military academy plays chess as a required subject.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
And they will look at a situation in the eyes of playing chess where if you spend a pawn here and you take a bishop or a knight in return, well, you've made a pretty good change. As long as you maintain your power position. And the one thing that Russia is deeply concerned about, their country's been overrun several times, you know. They've been occupied. And they're going to defend their country against any and everybody. And they don't want to jeopardize their power base. I think that's one of the great hopes we've got, that the Russians, as long as we stay strong in this country, that's where I couldn't agree more with President Reagan. We're building our strength back up. We're getting strong to protect the peace. We're not going to use it aggressively to take over land or occupy countries unless we're protecting our interests.
I can't understand why people here don't understand that.
Well,
They think, oh, we're
we've
spending
got
money.
people on this, unfortunately, this nuclear disarmament program, disarm at any cost, any price, who say it's better to be red than dead. And when people start talking and thinking like this, they're playing right into their hands, because
That's a
this is going down the same path that Chamberlain went down with Hitler back in the days of Great Britain
Peace in our
and
time.
Germany. It's the appeasement road, and you can appease up to a point. And of course, I can get on the soapbox on this one, because I maintain that in order to be a free people and maintain a free people, you've got to stay strong and be prepared to defend your freedom. And secondly, freedom is not free.
That's right.
It costs a price to stay free. And I think if people think more about this aspect of it. The other thing that's kind of good about this thing, it's frightening, but we haven't had another big war since World War II.
Well, not a big one.
Not really.
We made a mistake going into Vietnam,
Well,
but that wasn't.
we did the way the war was fought, but that war could have been won
Yes.
if we'd have done the things the military wanted to do. The political decisions are what cost us Vietnam. I say that without reservation, because I was in the middle of it.
I was in the middle of that.
But the thing is, we haven't had a World War III hasn't come up, and the reason why we haven't is because it's nuclear. Everybody's scared to death of this thing. You see, back in the old days, even the Crusades, kings, heads of government, seats of power, would start a war for a number of different reasons. Religious wars have been fought. A case of insult to some of the royal family. A case of somebody's got a lot of gold and jewels over here, and let's go get it. We'll get stronger. These things have all started wars. But in that kind of environment, the home plate, the power center, the castle, the king, have been safe. They send these armies out, the armies fight. Well, right now, these seats of government are just as much in the front lines as a boy with a rifle out there 1,000 miles from home. And this has got a lot of guys looking at this thing a little more carefully, because it's not a case of sick 'em, you go get 'em, fellas. It's a case of you sick 'em over here, well, they're going to be right back with you right in your lap. And I think this factor may, in the long haul, tend to give us longer stability, as long as we can keep things from getting crazy and out of hand, where people won't risk a nuclear war. There are people now preaching this business, well, let's build up conventional capability so we can fight another conventional war. Oh boy, I've been around enough of this slaughter and killing to know that a man's just as dead if he's stuck with a knife or shot with a bullet, or burned up with napalm, or blown apart with a piece of artillery, than he is if somebody hits him with a nuclear weapon. And the morality of the thing just winds up in a terrible situation, because I don't think people can justify killing and taking lives one method as being okay and another method is not okay. That's where I get in trouble with this thing.
I have one last question. When did you get your star?
1960, I was Chief Plans and Operations in Alaskan Command. I had one bit of interesting command job. When I came back to the States, I had this Air Defense Command when Cuba was real hot for 2 years. I was the guy that had the authority from Joint Chiefs of Staff to pull the trigger. In case,
Why didn't you pull it?
well, we had ground rules. We were in Lufberry down there with their MiG fighters out over the South of Miami, out over the sea where we would go. Not once, but several times. They'd come up with 8 or 10, 15 airplanes, and we'd meet them. We had things ready to go, and everything was armed, ready to pull the trigger. But the key was who made the first overt move. And that's where I sat in the hot seat, because I had to make the decision as to whether to fire or no fire. And that was interesting.
That was in 62.
62.
If you could have seen it ahead, what was coming by not going ahead.
Well, President Kennedy put the naval embargo on and forced Khrushchev to back down
Yes.
and withdraw the missiles from Cuba. I suspect if they had not backed down, then we'd have gone right after going in there. And we'd have lost some lives, but we would have protected all this hassle we got in South America now.
Yes.
Panama Canal and all that stuff's going on down the area that Castro is feeding. And the Russians have got submarines, they've got the deep sea port in Cuba. They've got long-range airplanes flying out of Cuba. They're patrolling our southern coastline, they're going down across South America. This gave them a base to operate from.
That's what I meant. If you could have seen it ahead, what?
Well, we could see it.
You could see what was
We
coming
could see it
ahead.
then.
But
Military
you
guys,
still didn't.
we weren't permitted to because of the political decision. I could write a long, interesting book on some of these things. I'll never do it, but it just fell my lot, not by any particular plan or purpose, to be in the center of a lot of these things that are going on. They're extremely interesting.
Well, anything else?
Yes, I have Gina's questions, but we won't have time for them. This has been a very interesting conversation.
I don't know whether I've given you what you wanted here or not.
A lot of good information. Thank you.
You bet.